every strategy comes with the trade-off, right? In every direction. You set goals that are too high and everyone's at 20, 30% of their target. Guess what? You lose a lot of AEs. Fast growth comes at a cost. There's a lot of downside to growing really aggressively and like pushing your team to growing really aggressively. I think the things that people miss is like, oh, we just set aggressive targets and then even if you get 70% of the way there, that's good. I'm like, nah, there's a psychology to it, right? Your team needs to feel empowered to charge the hill. They need to believe they've got the best technology in the market, that they're solving real problems for their customers, that they've got a shot of success. That's lost oftentimes in the boardroom. No one's like, oh yeah, I really want my salespeople to have confidence when they're going into their meetings. But I think it's an important detail for those of us who are people managers.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Bravado Pod. Today, I am so excited to have my dear friend and fellow natural wine connoisseur, foodie nerd, Tomer Chernia, the legendary SVP of Sales at Vercel. Tomer, welcome to the Bravado Pod.
Oh, why, thank you very much. And legendary, let me tell you, my wife saw, I think, your LinkedIn post, and she's like, legendary? Does he even know you? Thank you for that. Yes, glad to be here. Excited.
I mean, we certainly had a legendary bottle of wine and a meal together.
This is true.
So
you did. You plied me with some beautiful grilled octopus and some great wine. So yeah, excited to be able to chat.
Oh, I'm so excited, man. And the context for this pod, again, for those who are listening in for the first time, is that there are so many companies out there that are facing similar challenges where they've hit a certain milestone, a certain inflection point at their business, and now they're thinking, all right, how do I get to the next stage? And, with Tomer, the thing I really want to talk about is, when you're at that 15, 20 million ARR phase and you're trying to scale to the 100 mil plus phase of the business, what do you need to do? What goes right? What goes wrong? What breaks? How do you fix it? What are the things to look out for?
As we gear up for public company readiness, material financial disclosures are something that our team pays close attention to. So, responsible Tomer will kind of make sure that I share what I can here. The team was roughly, 20-something odd A's when I joined, and now the team is just shy of 200 and slated to grow pretty aggressively in the coming year.
Got it. And roughly what ARR were you at when you joined? And I know there was a public number that you shared a little while ago.
Yeah, in May 2024, we crossed the 100 million ARR mark and growing aggressively against that number even to this day.
Amazing. Got it. So, you join a team at a roughly 20, you grow that to roughly 100, and you've been there for about 3 years. And obviously that's a run that many companies would be really proud of and would want to emulate the success off of.
Yes.
So maybe start by telling me, what is it that made you join Vercel in the first place? I know you'd had a background at Segment and a branch. So maybe tell me a little bit about your decisioning process to join this specific company.
Absolutely. So it was one of our board members reached out to me and he's like, hey, Tomer, this is a great opportunity. It sounds like something that we really like up your alley. PLG, looking to grow out their sales motion, push into enterprise. It's a problem you're familiar with. And I think you should take a look at this company's kind of growing like a weed. I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty good. I'm happy where I am. And they pretty much twisted my arm, said, Tomer, don't be an idiot. You should take a meeting. So I did. And the stats were through the roof. Like I'd never seen anything like it. And just the absolute energy and enthusiasm for what it is that Vercel is building, not just the product, but also our contributions to the open source community. So that was it. And then I started, naturally pinging all of the really intelligent engineering leaders that I know. And at every single turn, it was one person's like, disclosure, we use them. I'm an investor. We absolutely love Vercel. It's the best. And it's every corner that I turned, I was hearing the same thing. And so I couldn't help but ignore the fact that there's a tremendous amount of traction and also just clicked with the team. I think we had a shared vision of what we wanted to do with the GTM org. And I mean, listen, as a sales leader, one of the things that you get promised when you first start is we've got more inbound leads than we know what to do with, which is something as a sales leader you always want to hear. And so that certainly helped kind of sway the decision.
Amazing. So, you and I started our careers in a similar space, which was in kind of the MarTech space. You were at a company called Wildfire. And, selling a product like Wildfire, kind of top-down enterprise is very different than selling a technical DevTools open source product. Can you talk about the distinction between those two things and how you've
Yeah.
made the evolution in your career? Because many sales reps struggle to go from one of those to the other. And there's this common sort of refrain that I've heard from VCs and from founders that like, oh, we don't want someone with that background because, they don't know how to work in this space, in the PLG space with, huge install base and a technical product. How have you been able to bridge
Yeah,
those in your career?
absolutely. And I'd say like even just shifting the buyer profile, well, I think like marketers have a very different set of criteria that they're looking for when they choose to buy a certain product, and certainly engineers do. I'd say engineers do not suffer fools well, and they are very principled in terms of how they think about buying decisions, but they also um, they're technologists, so they love to buy, but they hate to be sold to. And so I think kind of as I was thinking through kind of my transition, I personally always geeked out about the tech and how the product actually worked. And I found that I had the most success when talking to people who were actively using the product and appreciated like the craft of the products that I was building, both at Wildfire and then Branch and Segment, now Vercel. And I think when you recognize that the person who's at the core of the decision-making process is not the person who necessarily signs the check, that's the magic, right? It's the person who's in the product day to day who understands it, and being able to translate that for the rest of the organization, I think set me up well. Wildfire, being able to talk about the business impact more broadly about how to sell a technology in the organization. And I think my own kind of geekiness and desire to understand the product at a deep level, I think has made me successful in the PLG kind of sale.
Do you think that they are distinct profiles of salespeople? Like when you hire for your sales team, would you take on people who haven't sold to DevTools in the past, or do you think that that's a prerequisite?
I think it really depends. So I think we look at candidates in two different ways. We call them buy candidates, like the candidates who have all the right experience and they have the right background and they've sold bottoms up PLG at a DevTools company. Like we love to see those people. And then we have what we call the build candidates who might not have necessarily had that experience. And when it's a buyer's market and you're hiring a select number of people, you're going to buy the people with the appropriate level of experience. When you're scaling as fast as we did at Vercel, you sometimes also have to think, how do you open up the talent pool? And that means investing in potential and slope and build candidates. And absolutely, we'd hire for people who might not necessarily have the right background in terms of experience selling to developers, but have the kind of like raw profile that we think would make them a good fit for this type of motion. And in those scenarios, we make the bet.
One of the things that I've heard whenever I've spoken to founders and sales leaders who sell in the open source community is that, there's such an advantage if you have a great product like Vercel, the affinity from the market, the product's in the user's hands. But the big disadvantage, you said they don't suffer fools. I like that. But the big disadvantage is like many of those people hate talking to salespeople with such a passion that it can be incredibly difficult to get them to actually engage with a go-to-market motion, especially when the product's already in their hands. And so like they're already using it. And so how do you actually create the momentum for them to engage with the sales motion? How do you overcome that challenge? I mean, you've done it at a few different places now.
I think it's making sure that you equip the team to like I said, engineering people. I think this is generally true, but they love to buy, hate to be sold. And so I think kind of you have to shed some of the pushy sales tactics of yore to really kind of get people engaged and like really kind of get your team to care about the product and being able to solve a problem for customers. So having really thoughtful outreach, have a deep understanding of like what the software development lifecycle looks like, what it might look like for companies that are similar, the things that we kind of challenges that customers might run into that we might be able to help with. And I think if you focus on providing value to the person that you're talking to, you can overcome some of that stigma of I never want to talk to salespeople. I think is key. And when you think about like the charter for salespeople and like what I expect from them, it's like their job is to reduce friction in the process. Someone might be able to buy on the back of a credit card, and that's great. We want them to continue to give us their money and use the product and be advocates for us. But sometimes they run into some internal obstacle that makes that hard to do. They need to go through legal. There's a procurement process. They need access to certain security features. And that's kind of where you want your sales team to kind of be able to step in, is smooth that process for them.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. You mentioned thoughtful outreach. Can you
Yes.
elaborate a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, everyone has received thoughtful outreach, cold outreach from salespeople, and people have largely received mediocre personalized outreach. And so I think if you truly take the time to understand someone's business and some of the challenges they might be looking to face, and like craft something that really resonates and is personalized to that individual in that organization, I think more often than not, you capture their attention so long as you do it earnestly. If you do the very generic personalization of like, hey, Tomer, I saw you went to Berkeley. How go Bears? I want to sell you insert software XYZ. That doesn't quite work. Or even, hey, Tomer, I see you like natural wine. I mean, you might be able to bribe me with a nice bottle of natural wine, but like that's not enough, right? I want you to be able to shed some light on something about my business that I might not know about. And I think if you take the time to actually do that and maybe even teach me something that I didn't know before, I'm more likely to take the meeting and kind of like take you seriously.
Do you do that through an SDR motion, or do you have your AEs prospect, or how do you actually instrument that at Vercel?
Yeah, so we have BDRs, we have SDRs. We call them VDRs, Vercel Development Reps. We have to throw the Vercel branding, and AEs also source their own pipeline. So like AEs have a pipeline expectation in terms of how much pipeline they're expected to source themselves. But we do have traditional-ish kind of BDR motions.
Do you sell into companies that don't have active Vercel licenses and try to go just top down? You don't just rely on places where you already have adoption bottoms up?
No, no. And I think that's like, if you think about our mid-market business, a good chunk of our revenue comes from customers who are looking to upgrade plans. But a big chunk of kind of our enterprise motion is going after customers who might have adopted maybe Next.js, like our open source framework, or who might be in the process of going through some sort of migration, or that we think web experience can benefit from Vercel. And we try to convince them that we can solve their problems.
Have you found tools that equip your BDR team that help them do their job better? And I asked that question specifically through the lens of there's all these AI SDR companies out there that are promising to automate a lot of this research. Most of that outreach sounds a lot like Go Bears than it does, deep business case. And I wonder how you think about the balancing act between using automation, using triggers, using signals, using products, whatever. Like again, it's obviously easier if you have active users that you can plug into and talk about the use case of what they're doing with it. But in the case where you're kind of going in cold, how do you handle that today?
We have the benefit of a large ecosystem of people who have touched Next.js or Vercel, or have thrown up some declared intent that we believe is worthy of an outreach. And I think that's a byproduct of the fact that we have a really large reach and there's a really big open source footprint. So we use tools like Koala and Common Room to help us kind of like farm for smarter signals from people who visit our site and who engage with the community or our posts on X. And like that gives us some good signal. We also have a lot of people who might work at really large organizations, but sign up for a hobby account for their own little side project. And so that's also a great opportunity for us to reach out to an organization that might be not be using Vercel, some CTO at Nike, but they have some side project for, their daughter's school fundraiser on Vercel. And so how do we use that experience to kind of drive urgency? But long story short, AI, very promising. But I think when I look at what my VDRs do, I look at the things that are kind of dumb sucks of time, right? Where they're just sitting there, they're manually adding someone into a sequence. There's like steps in the process where they're conducting a Google search to pull up some like basic research about a company. Like those are things that I think we can automate. But you always want to make sure that you have someone who's kind of guiding the process and being a little bit thoughtful about what that outreach looks like for each individual customer, because it does look different. So we use a lot of tools to automate the signal collection. We use a lot of like non-AI driven automation to kind of like kill the time sucks when the things that can be done without a human having to take action, and then focus the human on the things that matter, which is like crafting a message that resonates.
One question along the same lines, which is how you think about the territory split of the team. Obviously, going from 20 to 200, you need to. I'm sure you've shifted the way that you manage accounts. What have you learned as you've gone through this hyper scale phase in terms of how you instrument the go-to-market motion relative to territories and assignments?
Yeah, it's going to change. I think like at a certain point when you first start out, you might not necessarily have the data or understanding to know what territories are actually rich patches. And so like the bigger you make the territory, the more opportunity you leave for like the right opportunities or right accounts to make their hands in the reps, kind of a little bit of laissez-faire capitalism going on in the book of business. And I think that's probably like in early stages, probably the best thing you can do versus creating a bunch of micro zip codes or states, creating broad strokes territories, east, west, north, south, maybe having multiple teams in territories, just allow you to kind of ensure that you've got coverage against the right types of accounts. And then as you get bigger and as you get like a little bit more robust understanding of the types of accounts that probably are the best fit for a company like Vercel, you can start getting a little bit more narrow and prescriptive about how you think about territories. We use employee count as the proxy for size. So our mid-market segment was like up to 200 employees and up to 1,000 employees. Now it's up to 2,000 employees. And then there's always the debate internally of, is employees the right way to actually segregate the universe, or is there something better? And there's pros and cons.
Yeah. What do you think about that?
I think there's usually two ways that you think about slicing up a universe. Like, how do you first ask, how do you make money? What's the biggest signal of the customers that are most likely to spend the most amount of money? And so in the Vercel kind of universe, that's probably sites that have either a lot of developers or get a ton of site traffic. Now, you might have some really small companies with a ton of site traffic, especially hot new startups. And in one principle, you want your most experienced salespeople working on your biggest deals. And so you're going to tier your universe. Maybe for us, it's based on site traffic is the meter. But I think what you lose in that is just because the deal is bigger doesn't mean that the motion is complicated.
Yeah.
It means that your economic buyer might be sitting right next to your user in the same office of 30 people versus you're selling to IBM and there's tens of thousands. And so I much prefer employee count because it's a good proxy for the complexity of navigating the sales process with the organization. And so I'd rather have my most experienced sellers working on the accounts that have the most complexity in terms of penetration versus purely indexing on where the big deals are going to be.
We face the same challenge at Bravado because, for us, the more sales reps a company is hiring, the more revenue opportunity there is for us. And it can be really tricky because you can have a company that has 10,000 salespeople that isn't hiring nearly as quickly as a company that has 500 salespeople, but is on like some hyper-growth path. And so like the urgency and need can be shifted distinctly between what you might traditionally call mid-market and enterprise. The other vector that tends to be challenging for us, I don't know if you experience this, but what we find interesting is that when you actually go to smaller companies, you often end up talking to smarter, more senior people because there's just fewer people that are involved in the decision. And so like if I want to sell to Vercel, I'm talking to you, I'm talking to like your VP of recruiting, I'm talking to like more senior folks. If I'm selling to a 10,000 person org, if I'm selling to Salesforce, I'm talking to some like, mid-market go-to-market recruiter or whatever. And like that person's just much easier to sell to because they're just not as fluent with all the cutting edge of tech and whatnot. Do you find that sometimes it can actually be more difficult to sell to a smaller company because you're talking to like more senior folks, or does it pan out that the complexity of the deal is the big term?
I actually think that smaller companies, I wouldn't necessarily say that the people you're talking to are smarter, but they have a wider perspective on the business. And I think that makes it easier for a product like Vercel because they can see the trade-offs of various different strategies at altitude when you're talking to someone senior. When you are selling to someone who's like a front-end engineering manager at Megacorp, like they don't have purview. They've got their job and the thing they're responsible for and their roadmap and their engineers. And sometimes being able to connect the dots like beyond their immediate problems to like what benefits the organization, I think is harder at large companies than at small companies. And that's why I think it's fun to have conversations with startups because the person you're talking to oversees the overall health and success of the business. And that allows for richer conversations.
I've never quite thought about it through the lens of aperture before, but that's a really good proxy for it. It's not intelligence or even seniority. It is aperture, isn't it?
Yeah, it's aperture perspective, and small companies, everyone acts like an owner, at least if they're doing it right. And I think at a large company, it's very easy to become just the person who represents your function, your division, your team. And that's just the nature of Megacorp.
What is the profile of salesperson that you think really succeeds in that mid-market, division? And then how is it distinct from the person that's selling to megacorp?
I actually think that there's a lot of the same attributes kind of like fall across both, but probably like a difference in maturity and experience, and like they have less patterns to match against. The thing that I think we care about deeply at Vercel, and probably like trade-offs in skill sets, is technical curiosity or technical drive. It's important when you're selling to engineers or to developers or to product people. I think it's more important for your mid-market sellers to be able to have that conversation, because the person who's buying the product is probably also the person who's using it or very close to. Value conversations about being able to justify the business impact are probably slightly less important, because in mid-market, mostly because a lot of our buyers are already primed to make a decision, and the goal is to kind of just like make it easier for them to adopt the product. Whereas in enterprise, I might trade some technical acumen for value fluency, just because when you think about like what truly drives really big deals at large enterprise corporations is people who can really connect the dots to business impact. Still a certain baseline level of technical fluency. I would love them to have the same level of technical fluency as our mid-market sellers, but you find that the thing that really spikes out those 7-figure deals is being able to connect the dots back to value.
That's such a great answer. That's super thoughtful. Oh, it just is, because I think that most of us end up kind of, without understanding what is the trade-off that we're really looking to make, and I think that your description of mid-market, smaller company, everyone acts like an owner, they really just care about like getting, they care about like, they understand the business impact very, very fluently because they see a wider set of the business, versus at a large company, you're just seeing your team, you're seeing your narrow set of problems. And so it can be really difficult to actually pull up and say, well, how is this going to benefit all of IBM? As opposed to like, how am I going to sell to this one tiny division of IBM where the deal is very small? That is its own skill set, isn't it?
It is. And you find yourself like dealing with more interpersonal and political landmines that you have to navigate in large corporations. How many times are you talking to someone who's like, I don't want you talking to my boss. I don't want you talking to my boss's boss. There's some frontline manager or director, and how do you navigate those conversations without alienating the person that brought you into the organization is always a challenge that I think really good enterprise sellers are good at navigating. And you've got detractors, big companies, billion opinions. You got to be able to navigate the detractors. Who's got influence in the organization? Why do they have influence? Who's wasting your time? I think those are all skills that you develop over your career as an enterprise seller. And I think they help you in startups, but those problems are less acute.
There's a lot of companies, tangentially to that, there's a lot of companies that struggle with sales hiring. And they, especially when they're trying to go fast, it feels like, a lot of it is in setting up the right process, the right questions, and being crystal clear on what are the criteria and heuristics that you're looking for. Maybe talk me through, have you gone through iterations of the interview process of Vercel?
A bajillion, yes.
Can you talk me through what you did early and how it's changed? I think I'd love to hear more about that.
I think there's a few things. First, you have to start with like two very important things to just kind of like highlight. What is your rubric? What are the things that you care about that you believe make for really successful salespeople? And making sure that your managers and your recruiters are highly calibrated on what that looks like. And then decide, is this a build candidate or a buy candidate? Are you looking for someone with the right amount of experience, or are you looking for someone with a certain level of potential? And I think as you're scaling, you start to think about build candidates of being a little bit of a source of talent for you, because you just have to hire so many people. But iteration-wise, how do you test things? Salespeople are really good at sounding really good in interviews. Even bad salespeople, somehow miraculously, the one skill they've inherited is the ability to sound really good in interviews that they've really honed. And so I think it's easy to get a lot of the right answers from salespeople. And so the key to really kind of like getting at bottom, if they're really meeting your criteria, is like, how do you test for the things that are harder to answer in just direct kind of like situational questions? And so for us, this is various permutations of like pitching Vercel or something like Vercel, or understanding how people think through their pitch process. In the early days, when the talent market was tight, what we used to do is say, hey, it's a big ask to ask someone to come in, create a presentation, and pitch Vercel. What if we just ask them to pitch their current product as if they're sitting next to a new AE who's joining the team, because teaching something is a good proxy for mastery. And so being able to say, this is where I stop and I ask this question. This is where I follow up with that question. And we found that it was like a helpful tool for being able to understand like how thoughtful they are about their existing motion, but it didn't test for technical curiosity. Did they take the time to understand the product they're about to sell? And so then we shifted into, okay, well, now we want people to come in and they're going to sell the Vercel. We want them to do like kind of a mock Vercel pitch. And that was great for being able to test like, okay, are they willing to go deep and do the research and understand the product and like be able to stand up to scrutiny against the product? We're experts. They're not in our own product. We're going to ask them questions, make them squirm. And they do well in those. But what we found is sometimes what you end up seeing a signal is people who are just also really good showmen, and you over-index on kind of, can they run the meeting? Can they elegantly navigate questions? Great skill, but it doesn't test some critical thinking skills, which is the next iteration of what we wanted to test through this process. And so what we've done is we actually do a discovery session. We give them a prompt. They do discovery. They have the opportunity to ask us a bunch of questions. And then we give them a 15-minute break to go off camera, to go into another room, and to come back and review the answers to those questions with basically with like a sales leadership team. All the people who are in that like mock discovery session are now their sales leaders inspecting the prospectus of this deal. And it really captures the people who are able to synthesize answers to discovery questions and how they tailor their approach versus just, knowing that there's like just moving on to the next question, which you typically tend to see happen in like pretty basic discovery. Can they think on their feet? Can they like synthesize information into something meaningful?
I think this is the first time I've ever heard of that being the interview process. I've heard of people doing discovery, mock discovery. I've heard of people doing mock demo. I've heard of people doing demo of their own product. I've heard of people doing demo of the product that you already sell.
Yep.
I have never heard of there being like a post-discovery synthesis session where you basically are like presenting the deal to the sales leadership and explaining the value prop and what you heard to try to like hear, like, it's the Sherlock Holmes quote, when you know what I'm going to say. It's like we all see the he's like, how did you know that? It's like, we all see the same things. It's just, not what you see. And I see that all the time where like you're reviewing gong calls with a mediocre or like up and coming sales rep who hasn't had the chops yet. And you both hear the customer say the same thing, but one person gets what they're really trying to say and the other person just takes the answer at surface value. And I've never actually thought about doing that in an interview process in order to assess, do they know how to listen and synthesize information? That's really clever.
And it's working for us now, but it makes it harder, right?
Yeah.
Because when you're growing, you need to add capacity. And so if you're thinking about like capacity as one of your constraints to growth, introducing a process that's harder takes a lot of discipline and a lot of conviction that if you get it right, you'll have the right people, and having the right people who can perform is better than having a lot of people who maybe not everyone is the perfect fit.
Yeah, I want to get to your ramp process and your training and onboarding process in a sec. But before I do, I just ending on this thread. There's one thing that is kind of the third rail of sales these days, which is remote versus in person.
Yes,
I would love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, we grew up. Most of our growth happened during the COVID era, pre-COVID era, post-COVID era. I think you get access to a lot of great talent when you're able to cast a wide net, especially when you're running up against capacity constraints. You're like, it's easier when I can go broader to find these like diamonds in the rough or these like gems of salespeople. But I think you miss out on a lot when you have a fully remote team. And so you miss out on the learnings, what the younger reps could learn from some of the older reps. You miss out on just like the conversations that happen in the margins. And I was a great beneficiary having come up in in-person sales culture. I learned a ton from the people I was around. But I also recognize that like I don't want people coming to the office to sit in a phone booth for 8 hours. And so what we've done is we have a distributed team, but I think as we think about hiring, it's concentrating more of our hiring in geos and investing in office space and kind of setting the expectation that we want people to be able to come into offices if they're near an office and key hubs. part of that is leading by examples, or like our leadership comes into the office on a regular basis. And people nearby, we encourage them to. You've got carrots and the like to get them to come into the office. But no one's going to come into an office if none of the people they collaborate with are there. And so it's kind of a bit of a chicken or the egg, but we're trying to move towards providing an option for more in-person collaboration. And I think the area where it's probably easiest to do or to kind of create some density is with SDR hiring.
Tell me more about that.
So when you think about, okay, I want to go enterprise whale hunter, I want to find the best person on the planet, but who can also operate at a startup that's running really fast and doesn't have all the resources, that's a hard person to hire. So you want to cast as wide a net as possible. You want to have the opportunity to be able to hire that person in Denver, Atlanta, or wherever they might be. But SDRs, you're betting on potential, and you're looking for less experience in that person. And so you can probably get away with like mandating or lowering or requiring that those people be in one of our hubs, just because there's more SDR candidates that you can recruit from versus like really kind of like upmarket AEs. And then it becomes kind of you future-proof your business. Those SDRs matriculate into mid-market AEs, hopefully enterprise AEs, and now you're starting to seeding the ground of like having like some truly dense in-office experiences.
Interesting. Are you yourself coming into the office?
I do.
Every day?
I'd say probably like 3 to 4 times a week. But I come in when there's people here. Like I'm not just going to come in to sit in a conference room by myself on Zoom all day. So executives come in Mondays and Fridays. That's kind of like the expectation. So the rest of my peers and the rest of the executive team are all here on Mondays and Fridays. And so we set up a lot of our one-on-ones, our meetings, our collaboration time on those days. And there's always some team doing some offsite, whether it's the marketing team or whether it's a CS team or whether it's the DevOps team that come into the office on random days. And that kind of, if there's people here, I'll be here.
You're the 4th consecutive SVP of Sales, CRO, who's come onto this podcast who has said some version of what you just said, which is we used to be remote. We've started to move more in person. We're starting with the SDR team. We're like developing this culture of in person. Vanta owner. Like I just continue to hear the same refrain over and over again. And one thing that it makes me wonder is, do we feel like the sales teams of the last couple years have relatively underperformed and thus we are course correcting? Or do we feel like we're in a new age of growth and we want to lean into the momentum? I wonder how we're thinking about that decision.
I don't think it's lack of performance. And I could say this is probably true for me and lots of peers. Like they've seen a lot of great performance from people who work remote. But I think you lose the cultivating the next generation of talent when you're fully remote. And that's why I think SDRs are a great source. They've got the most upside. You hire these people who are full of potential. How do you make sure they develop into that? And I think it's much harder to teach and to kind of transmit the wisdom remotely than it is in person. And so I think we've got a lot of benefits in the remote world of being able to hire from anywhere, and like it opens up the talent pool, but I think we lose like the up leveling of the more junior people in their career by not having access to other humans in person.
Well said. And I'm going to keep an eye out on this trend. I'll tell you what is interesting about the AE profile side of this. So, we do a lot of surveying. We obviously have a ton of salespeople on our site. And one of the things we track is percent to quota and benchmark that against willingness to work in office versus remote. So the average rep who is willing to come to the office, if you culminate, 200,000 people or something, and you look at what percent to quota they hit in 2024, the average amount is 57%. So 57% of those people hit quota. So 57% of reps who hit quota, did that the wrong way. Of all the reps who are willing to come into the office and work in person, 57% of them hit their number in 2024. If you look at the same pool of people, but now you look at only those people who are only willing to work remotely, 79% of them hit their quota.
Oh, wow.
And so what we're finding is reps who aren't hitting their quota are more willing to come to the office. Reps who are hitting their quota are less willing to come to the office, which kind of maps a little bit to the seniority thing. But actually, we did this. We actually cut it by seniority to see if it was just a seniority thing. And by excluding SDR, where SDR, it is very clear that SDR performance in office is markedly better than SDR performance outside of the office. That is empirically true across all data sets. When it came to even like SMB, mid-market, more junior AE roles, it turns out that those reps who are unwilling to come to the office disproportionately hit their quota at a higher pace than those who are willing to come to the office.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting
causation correlation. Yeah.
But it's no different. Your best reps are also divas that never fill out their Salesforce notes in a way that you kind of want them to. And it's not because it's not because they don't fill out they're not as good about Salesforce hygiene that they hit their number, but it's because they hit their number that they can get away with probably a little bit more lax Salesforce hygiene. So I see it. I'm like, if you're a talented, super successful rep, you probably have a little bit more latitude about like working on your terms.
And that's where I think there's some really interesting trends to the future. So I think for junior folks, it makes sense. And I think for super senior enterprise folks, you're going to hire them anywhere. But it's this middle ground, right? It's the mid-market rep that we just spent some time talking about. If the best mid-market reps are being the pickiest about going back to the office, but the best companies, the Vantas, the Vercels of the world, are insisting that more people come to the office, that creates a really interesting tension in the market because, does it mean that the best reps are going to say, okay, well, I'm only going to join a little bit of a riskier startup because I want to maintain my lifestyle? Or is it going to be that you are going to be able to convince these people to come to the office and eventually the pendulum's going to shift the other way? I don't know how it shakes out, but I think it's an interesting trend to watch in 2025 that those
Agreed.
reps who are the least likely to want to come to the office are actually the people who are the highest performing across the Bravado network.
It is interesting. I would posit it's causation. It's correlation, not causation. But it does raise interesting questions. And I think at a certain point, like there's a culture as a company that you want to instill in people and that you want to build. It's easier to build a culture, and a shared set of values live. And as you scale the organization, like it's very easy that, next year, almost half of the people who will be at Vercel will probably people who, more than half of the company will have started in the last year, I think is the numbers that we've been throwing around internally. Wow. It's very easy to lose what makes that company special. And I think when you have people in person, it's much harder. It's much easier. They opt into a certain working style, but like it's easier to kind of keep that shared set of values amongst people.
The only challenge I'll have to that is that you began this podcast by saying that you had 20 reps when you started and now you have 200. And yet it seems like you've been able to keep a really strong culture across that despite being remote. And so like, I actually tend to agree that in-person cultures are much stronger than remote cultures. As someone who operates a remote company, but previously operated an in-person company, we went remote when we moved to COVID. I would dare say that the friendships and the relationships that we had cultivated prior to going remote are still stronger than the ones that we built remotely. I think there's no doubt that is true.
Totally.
But if I look at the performance of the company, if I remove my own personal desire to like be close to people and I look at the quality of talent, how much we're paying for that talent and the overall performance of the company, I think there's no doubt that we have more talented, higher performing folks who are delivering at a higher clip than we did prior to us going remote. And it's certainly been much easier to hire higher quality people by casting a wider net. So it is something that I'm also conflicted about. And I don't mean to say that I agree or disagree with you. I just think I find this topic so interesting because Vercel obviously is such a, it's one of the 5-10 companies that anyone who's building anything in AI, open source, DevTools looks up to. And your opinion and your practices are going to carry a lot of weight because there are so many companies that want to be in the same position that you guys are. So I'm just super interested how you think about it.
And I'm not an absolutist, right? There's trade-offs in all of these different strategies. I do think that we are, it's not just for the 200 people, it's for the next 1,000, 2,000 people.
Right.
Right. And I do think that if you think about it on a longer time horizon, I think there's no doubt that we've been able to probably see a lot of efficiency gains and productivity gains by people working remotely, but like at what cost? And do we pay that cost now? Maybe not, but are we going to pay that cost in 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years from now? That's the real question. And I think as a sales leader, it's easy to think about 1 quarter, 1 year at a time. But like when you zoom out the horizon, you're like, oh, well, maybe I do want more people in the office over the fullness of time, and I think there's some benefit to it. But cool. I hear you. It's an interesting trend to follow.
It's true, and I also, have a lot of conflicting thoughts on it. But I'm always excited to dive in to somebody who has had the type of success that you have had building a remote company and is now shifting to an in-person culture. Because I find that to be maybe the greatest harbinger of the future of what's going to come. Because if a company like Vercel is going to move to a more in-person, then it's inevitable that everybody else will too.
I also want to make sure that, to all of my reps who are listening, no one's going to force you to move to an area where you're near an office. I just want them to all know, you got to create space for both options, but I think you have to be intentional about the type of company that you want to build.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, let's shift gears to once you got the people in house. So the people are here. Let's talk about what sort of ramp training, and especially I think what's interesting is around the build candidate that you're talking about. How have you managed to make people successful? What have you invested in, or maybe what did you underinvest in initially that you started putting more into? I'd love to hear more about that.
I think there's a handful of things. When you're growing really fast and you're adding a lot of people to the organization, enablement is never going to be as robust or as good as you ever want it to be. And it's never going to be perfect. And so I think you have to, first in the hiring process, invest in super high agency people who are also genuinely curious and willing to open doors and find information, even if it's not spoon-fed to them. So I think it starts at the hiring process. When you're thinking about your build candidate, part of the calculus is is this a person who, if I drop them in tomorrow with no training, will they eventually figure out how to get things done? Now, you want to make that easier for them, and you want to reduce the amount of time that they're spending on frivolous activities. But the bet that we're making on the build candidate is that they can figure out the basics with minimal guidance. Now, what we did, I think, in the very early days of our enablement journey is I think we hired more traditional enablement profiles to run our enablement organization. People who would normally be part of learning and development teams. They're really great instructional designers. And we found that what was actually changing at a great pace was the way that we sell and the types of customers that we have, and the business was changing month over month. And the instructional designers and the L&D people are always looking to the sales team for expertise of how do we actually translate into something that we can kind of teach people about. By the time we get it ready to be taught, it's already kind of out of date in some way, shape, or form. And so one of the big pivots is building actually an enablement team that's relatively lean of former practitioners, former sales engineers, former sellers, former sales leaders, people who've been in market, some of whom have been sellers and sales engineers at Vercel. And how do we get them focusing full time on enabling and training the rest of the team? So I think there was an organizational decision about how we wanted to staff an enablement team of people who are responsible for helping support our new hires, putting a lot of onus on the managers. Managers are it's very easy for your sales managers to be I need enablement, and to assume that something gets handed to them, but they're the closest to the problem. Especially new managers, when they come on board, they go through the onboarding process and they find gaps. They're I don't know how to do this thing or that thing, or I didn't really understand it. And so they're constantly iterating, and I'm putting a lot of weight on the managers to ensure that their teams have what they need to be successful. And then there's other things that we've done, what we call a baseline technical cert. So like I said, it's incredibly important. You're selling to technical customers. We have a training and an exercise where we ask all new hires to build and launch their own app/website on Vercel. And that's a core part of the onboarding process. You have to have an appreciation for how the product works, how a customer would use it. We got rave reviews, and I think we continue to add to what we think are the baseline technical competencies we want in people on the team.
Super thoughtful answer, and a lot of unpacking to do there.
Yeah.
Maybe just initially, I'd love to understand, have you seen that when you hire someone and they go through this initial period, they go through their certs, et cetera, that it's highly predictive of future performance? Like how closely have you seen that correlate versus people who come in, maybe don't pick it up as quickly, but then pick it up later on? Like, I wonder how quickly you move on from candidates when you're uncertain that you made the right bet.
Yeah, I think you figure it out pretty quickly from the people who are willing to put in the effort to actually get it right. And like it showcases an appreciation for understanding the guts of our sales motion. And if you can't get excited about the technology that you're selling, and if you can't go through the tech cert process, then it's just never going to work out. And so you see it. I'd like to say that we've done a pretty good job of selecting for technical curiosity and drive, but sometimes sometimes you get it wrong.
Let's shift gears a little bit to a topic that I think many AI companies in particular are struggling with, which is, how do you think about quotas and compensation?
Yeah.
I think this is a topic that's hard for a few different vectors. One is, oftentimes it can be free or really cheap in order to get started. And then secondly, it can be hard to predict how big the account is going to get over time. Thirdly, how much is the AE actually responsible for driving that adoption? Sometimes expansion happens much later on, but then they don't get credit. Like, how have you managed all of the complexities around quotas and comp, and what iterations have you gone through?
Yeah, I mean, we've quotas have stayed. I mean, they go up. My team hates that, especially when your team does well. I had to break it to our sales leaders. We had an epic year, and they're like, "Oh, so tell us about quotas." I'm like, "Well, you know what's going to happen. They're going to go up." Welcome, congratulations. You are now victims of your own success. But I think of quotas and commissions as kind of like another dimension is also profit, because some of these AI products aren't particularly high margin. And so like that factors into how you think about paying people. But I think about quotas as they're a cost control mechanic, right? It's really like you need to make sure that like your overall commission stack for everyone on your team is below 20%, more or less. And so some ways you can tackle that is by having higher quotas. Some ways you can tackle that is by having we have various structures in our comp plans, whether it's a flat base commission rate versus an accelerating, decelerating base commission rate. We pay for things that are not quota, right? Multi-year deals are things that we kind of pay around with. We used to not pay our reps on usage at all, and now we've introduced like reps get a percentage of like on-demand usage for their products or things that are not committed. We're actually going to probably move to giving reps more credit for usage, just because we want to shift the way that the business thinks about committed dollars versus usage dollars, and kind of like unlock more of a flywheel in terms of how customers use the product. And so we've gone through various incarnations. Quotas started as a multiple of OTE. There's still some of that math in terms of the way that we think of quotas, but they go up, and you play around with the comp plans to try to keep things under 20%.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. How often are you reforecasting based on growth? Because I think one of the other challenges that a lot of these companies are facing is, in January you say, okay, here's your number for 2025. You get to May, June, and you're like, okay, that number was either way too high or way too low, and like we need to like rethink about it. How often do you do that?
I mean, well, our CFO does it with a high level of frequency, where he comes in and he's like, we've done well. We need to increase the number. Come in at the start of the year once you've done all your capacity planning, or halfway through the year, and you're like, that's not how enterprise sales works. You can't just like magic wand and the number goes up. But joke's on me, because we've always hit his numbers, so I guess he was right and I was wrong. But maybe you can, adjust things. But the way that I think about it, we actually had the opposite problem in the early days. Capacity planning was much harder, especially when you're growing, and like, how do you assign a quota to a manager who doesn't have a rep in seat? And so we had quarterly targets. And what ended up happening there is you saw people absolutely smashing through these quarterly targets to the point that it was kind of a little absurd, the amount that you're paying them for like quarterly performance. And so we shifted to annual targets for all segments, including our mid-market segments. And the goal there was to give them more of a long-term view of how they think about approaching accounts and like getting them to push up market. And it's largely worked for us. And we haven't changed quotas mid-year, mid-quarter. Like, we've kept them pretty consistent against the annual number. And we make the best guess about what we think that is based on historicals. sometimes it might be a little too low, and then the next year you calibrate accordingly. But you always want goals to be aggressive but attainable, and I'll always index on trying to find that balance where possible, and not getting all worked up about you constantly have to raise quotas to make sure that you match what the company's growth rate is.
Yeah, let's talk about that from the other side. Let's talk about your expectations relative to the board and the CFO, which you talked about a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
This is another problem that a lot of these fast-growing AI companies are facing, is that, you have Glean that went from 1 to 100 in 3 years. You have, some other company that goes from, 2 to 50 in a year. And all of a sudden you've got your board and your CEO and your CFO coming to your door and saying, hey, I know we're doing great relative to the historical SaaS benchmark, but compared to these new AI companies, we're fucking slow. We need to grow faster. And they're being faced with these incredibly daunting numbers based on how AI companies are able to grow. I'm sure you face some of that across your career.
We do.
And I wonder how you think about that.
Yeah, but what's interesting is we actually break out our AI revenue from our direct cogen product V0, and it has different targets from the rest of the business. So it makes it a little bit easier in terms of how we think about that part of our business and the growth rate of our core
V0
AI product
versus
Vercel core platform. And so that makes it a little bit easier. But I think we also do something a bit unusual. We have one number. The board number is the company number. I think in most companies they have there's the board number, which is a little bit lower, and the company number, which is a little bit higher, and they hedge their bets. But we are, because we've been so successful, I think constantly trying to push ourselves up to more aggressive targets. And we set one target. It's the board target. It's the company target, and we all kind of align around it and try to do our best to get to it. And we've been fortunate enough to be successful there, but the board's not coming in and saying, you got to grow X, Y, and Z faster. I think they want to make sure that we're growing. We're fortunate enough to have a board that's thoughtful and wants to make sure that we're also growing in an efficient manner. And we're doing so thoughtfully, and that we're not just, Tomer, you need to add another 200 million, go hire 1,000 salespeople. Is there pockets to unlock efficiency with the team? And the board has been very good at oftentimes being the ballast against aggressive growth for us and making sure that we're doing it thoughtfully.
Cool. That's good to hear. If you were in the situation where that went awry, or if you had advice for someone who was facing those challenges, what do you think you might suggest if someone was not in the fortunate situation that you're describing?
Yeah, I think it's yes, these AI companies are growing really quickly, but every strategy comes with the trade-off, right? In every direction. You set goals that are too high and everyone's at 20, 30% of their target, guess what? You lose a lot of AEs, and now it becomes that much more expensive to add new AEs. If you are, if you've got, a board that's pressuring you to continue to juice numbers from your team where, you don't think the performance is actually there, I think you got to have a first principles conversation of understanding why something's growing, why it's not growing, what are the trade-offs, and really highlight whether or not it's worth it for your business. Growth comes at a cost. Fast growth comes at a cost. There's a lot of downside to growing really aggressively and pushing your team to growing really aggressively. And so, you might hit a target for a year, but what does that do for you in the next year? Keeping an eye on, for us, we're very, very mindful of efficiency and not just top line growth, because as you grow and we gear up to the next chapter of growth and public company readiness and all the maturity that comes with it, you pay attention. I can grow really fast, but what does it cost me to do so, and is it worth that trade-off?
Amazing. Makes a ton of sense. I think it's hard for folks to push back when they feel this pressure from the market, and I think having a first principles reason thinking around this kind of stuff makes a lot of sense. And I think the inverse is really expensive. You have a lot of companies who set unrealistic targets based on board pressure and then end up churning out a bunch of their team, or end up with morale going through, sinking, and then all of a sudden you have to rebuild the machine, and that's a lot harder and more expensive.
And I think the things that people miss is we just set aggressive targets, and then even if you get 70% of the way there, that's good. I'm nah, sales there's a psychology to it, right? Your team needs to feel empowered to charge the hill. They need to believe they've got the best technology in the market, that they're solving real problems for their customers, that they've got a shot of success. If they're always back-footed, they're a team that's constantly at 50, 60% of their number is not a team that's going to hit 100% of their number magically, because they're so far behind in some way, shape, or form. And I think you need to be mindful of the psychology and the motivations of the people on your team. And I think like that's lost oftentimes in the boardroom. No one's like, oh yeah, I really want my salespeople to have confidence when they're going into their meetings that they're gonna, do well. But I think it's an important detail for those of us who are people managers to be mindful of.
Dude, this has been such a dense podcast. I could honestly spend another like 6 hours with you on this. And in fact, I would love to have you back in a few months to do part 2. But before I let you go, I want to spend just a few minutes on some lightning round questions to end on a lighthearted note. My first question is maybe my favorite, which is that we often talk here at Bravado about how sales is a superpower, and it extends far beyond your professional capacity. And so maybe give me an example of where you've used your sales superpower in your personal life in order to get some benefit.
Oh, I mean, this is obvious for me as a foodie and natural wine person, is becoming friends and asking good discovery questions of people at restaurants and wineries that open up doors in ways that are not easily accessible. Example, we were in Paris. We were at some wine bar I became friends with somehow by taking like an active interest in the person who was managing this bar. And he's like, you know what? Tomorrow I'm going to this industry wine tasting event where there's going to be a bunch of great natural wine producers, and I'll introduce you to some of the makers and my friends. Why don't you come with me as my guest? You get that as a byproduct of like taking an active interest in people, like, really kind of doing the things that as a salesperson you do well, and it opens up doors. And it was an absolutely amazing experience. And everyone says Parisians are very rude to Americans, but I experienced the complete opposite.
Yeah, it turns out that sales is the magical language that unlocks friendliness in everyone. Next question is, what is the best advice that somebody gave you early in your career that these days we've gotten too woke in order to be able to give this advice, but that you think actually served you really well in your career?
Yeah. So there's a line that we don't use all the time, but it was thrown around all over the sales pit when I first started selling, which is buyers are liars. And this was the thing, is like, your buyers are going to lie to you. And I think it's wrong, because I don't think there's actually like malicious intent from the people that you're buying from to mislead you. But I do think there's a lot of wisdom in the fact that like what you're being told by your customers might not always be the complete story. And they might not be trustworthy narrators. And so like, how do you stress test your champions? How do you verify information that's being delivered from the people that you're talking to? So great feedback. But you'll never hear me tell my team that buyers are liars, because it's bad, albeit pithy.
It is pithy. And I like your description of it, which is unreliable narrator. It's not malicious. It's just that is the world as they see it.
Exactly.
But perspective is itself, misguided, and so
it's their lived truth, or whatever the term is. And there's benefit in understanding it, but sometimes you gotta think critically about it.
Amazing. And last question for you is, if you could pick any fictional person to join your sales team that you think would do a phenomenal job, any sort of pop culture reference, whatever you want, who do you think would make a great salesperson?
I mean, it's got to be like Charles Xavier. He's a mind reader. Like, it's
Wow.
not. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. He would crush it.
Wow. I've never heard that answer.
Really?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, is that a common answer that like everybody has? I've never heard of.
You said fictional character. I'm going superpowers.
I mean, I've gotten a lot of like Wolf of Wall Street kind of stuff, like is sort of thing. I don't know that I've ever heard somebody mention X-Men in this. That's pretty good.
If not, and if you want like human without powers, I would go. You mentioned him earlier, like Sherlock Holmes would be a great DevTools seller, or has magic but kind of off kilter, is like a Hermione from Harry Potter. I also think would be a great tech salesperson.
I have heard Hermione before. That's a good one. But no, I'm sticking with Charles Xavier. I think that's a pretty cool one.
It feels like a cheat answer though.
It feels like a great answer. I think that's actually I think it's clever. All right, my friend, thank you so much for the time.
Yes.
It's 3 to 6 months from now. Let's do this again. And I wish you the best discovery of the best natural wines. We'll trade some notes and we'll have a good time.
Likewise, my friend. Take care.